Well, someone who knows all too well the pressures on the military budget is the former Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace. It's great to have you with us. So the US and Russia have started negotiations on a possible deal to end the war in Ukraine. I mean, is that something to be welcomed?
Look, I think people talking about it is fine, right? But so far it hasn't really got off to a very good start. The United States basically took off the table all of its potential commitments, so it effectively removed its own skin from the game. And at the same time, Zelenskyy was excluded, as was members of Europe. I mean, not just the EU, but Britain and everyone else, the other stakeholders. So as we've seen today already, it's slightly unravelled. You know, you've got Lavrov being very clear that his red line is no foreign troops under whatever badge, NATO, European Union flag, UN flag, he said is totally unacceptable, were his words. Now, that's rather interesting because, you know, why could possibly Russia not want any peacekeepers in Ukraine? Because, of course, the reality is, you know, I know Putin will be back for more. He was back for more in 2014, so they don't want that. And secondly, Zelenskyy isn't involved and isn't in the room. And understandably, Zelenskyy represents the country that is under attack and is the ones that are having to make the sacrifices. And I find it very interesting. Russia is up to its old tricks, telling Ukraine what it can do with its own territory. You can't have these troops. You can't do this. I don't understand. Russia doesn't seem to understand it's a sovereign nation. It's not in Russia's gift to dictate to other countries. So it's not got off to a great start, but it is to some extent a start, but we'll see.
I mean, it's interesting. You're pretty concerned, clearly, about that. And it feels to me what you wrote in the Telegraph in the wake of the Munich Security Conference this weekend is quite important. I wonder if you could expand a bit on it. You said this year's gathering seems set to mirror the disastrous conference of 1938, where the continent stood blind in the face of Hitler's duplicity. The stench of appeasement is once again returning to Munich.
Yeah, well, so the Munich conference in 1938 was characterised by two issues. One was appeasement. If we just give Hitler a little bit more, it'll all be fine. Just give him bits of Czechoslovakia. And also Czechoslovakia weren't in the room. So the Allies handed over, territory that wasn't even theirs to hand over. And the second part of the characteristic was all along Hitler had a different plan. He was duplicitous insofar as he had planned to expand the German Nazi regime anyhow. So he was deceiving them from day one. And I think what we can tell by Russia's actions in the past is Russia's not going to abandon its plan to absorb Ukraine into a greater Russia. Putin wrote that in an article himself the year before, that Ukraine isn't really the country that we all think it is. And secondly, the Europeans, including the United Kingdom, if they're not careful, will be seen to run away from their obligations in protecting that security of Ukraine.
Just to be clear, you think that the West, I guess, the US, Europe, is appeasing Russia potentially in the same way that Hitler was appeased before World War II?
Well, I think Donald Trump's opening gambit on the negotiations looked like appeasement. Taking everything off the table before the negotiations had started. If you remember, he said, we won't put American boots on the ground, we won't give a security guarantee, Ukraine will have to basically accept the loss of its territory. I mean, what was left to negotiate? And I think, ultimately, I see two sides. I see those that protect international law, uphold human rights, don't inflict war crimes on people, and respect sovereign borders and don't think they should be changed by force. That is predominantly the West. And I see Russia, who has no qualms about breaking that. And there's no equivalence here, but I'm afraid those that wish to appease seem to try and make Putin the equivalent of Zelenskyy, or in fact more stronger or senior to Zelenskyy. Donald Trump today wouldn't answer the question of whether he saw them as equals. And I think in that very fact, that is an appeasement.
Donald Trump, after he got off the phone to Putin last week, said, I believe he wants peace. I know him very well. I think he wants peace. I think he would tell me if he didn't.
Well, I think he wants peace. He's lost 700,000 soldiers, most of his land forces. He's either lost them dead, killed, dead, injured or deserted. I mean, he has actually suffered huge losses. He's now got Sweden and Finland in NATO. He's one of the most sanctioned nations on earth. Russia is now lesser as a result of his actions. Of course, he wants peace, but he doesn't want to give up his views of a greater Russia and his determination to absorb Ukraine. And I think that's the thing he has to accept, that he's not going to be able to do that.
Let's talk about peacekeeping forces, because you mentioned there at the beginning of the interview the idea of peacekeeping forces and what that would look like. I mean, Keir Starmer said he's willing to send UK troops there to act as a peacekeeping force. I mean, obviously, we've got the Russian response to that, saying that they wouldn't accept it. But is that the UK showing leadership? Do you welcome that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's been talked about for some time. I mean, Britain had troops in Ukraine before the invasion, as did Sweden, Canada and the United States. After 2014, something called Operation Orbital, we went in to help build their capacity. Wasn't a combat deployment in the way that Russia would allege. We just trained people and helped them be better forces. So we've been there a long time. It is Ukraine's right to invite nations, not Russia's right, onto its soil. I would support it. But there's another part of the US messaging that I don't think the penny has really dropped yet in Europe, which was the very clear remarks by both the US Secretary of State for Defence at NATO and followed up by the Vice President, that Europe has to carry a greater weight of contributing to its own security and therefore Ukraine's security, because Ukraine is obviously Europe. We've been deaf to it for a decade. Obama started this. And so therefore the other part of this is if we're going to put men and women of the British Armed Forces potentially in harm's way, we need to invest in our defence, properly invest, not a little bit of smoke and mirrors.
What would a proper investment look like? What do you want to see? Because Donald Trump said 5% of GDP. Most people I speak to say that's unrealistic. But what?
Well, America isn't at 5%. There are two halves to this. So it's first of all, you've got to get to whatever level you want to. You can't just.
What is the right level?
So I think 3% by 2030. And the waypoint on the way to that is 2.5 by 27 or 26, because you have to be able to actually spend the money you're given. You can't just grow a battleship in a year. You can't suddenly recruit thousands of people. You can't, you have to invest and it takes time. So, if I was in the Treasury, it has to be a sustainable growth in your budget. I think it would be unfair to demand of the government that they immediately spend 3% tomorrow morning, because if you did spend 3% tomorrow morning, it simply wouldn't be spent. But you need a rising budget that gets you to, I think, 3%. And if we were all on 3%, I think we would be able to not only defend ourselves, but take action wherever we wish to defend ourselves and our allies.
I mean, I guess some people listening to this would think it's a bit rich coming from a Conservative politician, right? You hear John Healey saying, well, the first thing that the Conservatives did when they got into power in 2010 was to cut the defence budget.
Yeah, well, it's a bit rich. In 1997, they cut the defence budget as soon as they got in. I mean, I think that the comments I have made...
But it's fair, though, isn't it? You yourself say the army's been
I increased the defence budget by £31 billion, right? So no one else had done that You
didn't get to 2.5% of GDP, though,
No, but I took it from a much lower 2% right up to 2.3%. If you look at the significant decreases in defence, I've always said it, and it's been twisted, I'm afraid, by the Labour Party, which I think is beneath them. I have said that for decades, both Labour and the Conservative hollowed out defence, right? They took spending about 3.8% of GDP in 1991, and they continue to cut it and cut it and cut it and cut it and hollow it out because there was a peace dividend after the Cold War. That's perfectly understandable. But they kept on taking, and it became corporate raiding. And only when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he gave me a record settlement, a proper budget, to try and turn that round. All the governments of all colours have reduced defence spending, and it's either been feast or famine. But fundamentally, it has been a downward trajectory. I think when Labour came into power, it was 3% of GDP. I think when they left, it went down to 2.1, and then it rose up again to 2.5 after the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. But we still ended up with snatched Land Rovers and hollowed out forces. Fundamentally, we need a long-term plan that says 3% by 2030, no smoke or mirrors. And there are plenty of people in both parties who believe this. This is not about all right for you as a Tory to say it, all right for you as a Labour Party. John Healey absolutely is a supporter of more money on defence. He just said it again today. His challenge is, will he get it from his Chancellor, and will his Prime Minister convert the words into actions?
Just finally, do we need to be more joined up with Europe? Because as you say, one of the big messages to come out from America is, look, Europe, you guys need to step up. So does that mean, if we are going to be more strategic about this, we need much more joined up thinking about European capability?
Well, we're lucky that we have actually an even older alliance than the EU, NATO, which is, 75 years old plus. that has been in place designed specifically for joining up. And that's what it does. It's an alliance, a military alliance. We train together, we exercise together, we sometimes procure together. So that's all there. What America is saying, you've got to pull your weight, you've got to step up to the plate and contribute to your security. And that is not arguing over 0.2% of GDP and little bits here and little bit there. That is a fundamental reprioritising of all of our political priorities at home to fund it. That's the real question the Americans are asking us. Do you really want to take care of security? And if you do, you're going to have real cuts to other budgets to deliver it. And a Prime Minister's job is to choose. To lead is to choose. No more smoke and mirrors, no more everyone's a winner, there aren't really any cuts, no more we'll just cut lots of civil servants and magically we'll have a budget. Keir Starmer needs to stand up and say, today I'm cutting the roads budget or the aid budget or the pensions bill or the benefits bill or whatever it is to show that defence is a higher priority than it's been in the past.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting to speak.